Tonight we welcome you, and it's a pleasure having you here as part of Night School 2025, as part of its public events, and the school is now in its 4th edition. Night School is an annual month-long program of seminars and public events led by architect and writer Todd Reisz for dedicated encounters with urbanism history in Dubai under Art Jamil's lifelong learning initiatives. Todd Reiss's important work examines the global practice of architecture, specifically how the architect circulates technologies and cultural narratives. His book, Showpiece City, How Architecture Made Dubai, is available at the Jamil shop. It explores architecture's packaging to sell Dubai on a global stage. He has also co-edited a Building Sharjah, an archival investigation of the Middle Eastern city's vanishing 20th century landscape. So please join me in welcoming Todd, who will then introduce our session tonight. And thank you to my dear colleagues, Giacomo, Yazan, Jana, and Majd for realizing Night School 2025.
Thank you, Uns. Uns Katan and Giacomo Pietro Lamborizio have given so much energy for us to be here this evening. So thank you to them. Welcome to Night School's 3rd event as part of here at Art Jamil. And tonight's conversation, as you can see, is titled Tending to the Ruins. Night School here asks you to take a close look at your surroundings. Or as our guest this evening, Marvi Mazhar, puts it, pay attention to your built environment. Really pay attention to it. Taking stock of something right in front of you, let's say maybe the building you live in, to fully grasp that building requires mapping vaster geographies that surround that building. Many historical forces were in action for that building to land where it is today. Buildings help us read the space around us. They are also like us in another way, because they are on the move as well. They reveal a time before our time, and they betray that they will endure time longer than we will, at least in some form. This year, our theme is Lifelines, and I think that is a good description of where we sometimes mean by lifelines. So Night School here is premised on a desire to talk about history here in Dubai, to give words to how we move through this visual legacy that we call a city. And every night at Night School, we take a moment to acknowledge the fact that we convene in a port city. And what's special about tonight is that we're going to follow the wakes of the ships on their way to another port city, Karachi. How many people are familiar with Karachi, have been there or lived there? Not too many, okay. As I said, this is our 3rd of 4 open events, open to a broader audience at Night School. And these open events are in addition to actually the heart of Night School, which is the seminar program. So for this program, Art Jamil selected 15 UAE residents to participate in this very intensive 3-week program. And actually, I see in the audience some of our previous participants from the last few years who are with us this evening. As I said, this is the 3rd open event. So we've already hosted lectures by anthropologist Neha Vora, historian John Thabiti Willis. And then after this evening, on Saturday, so this Saturday evening, artist and film curator Hind Mizeno will host our final event, and that being a film program of 4 short films that respond to our theme of lifelines. So there's something you need to know as a bit of pretext about this evening. Earlier this week, Marvi Mazhar, Ayesha Qaisar, Giacomo, and I, we walked around Malaysia and museum squares in Sharjah. We noted the missing mixed towers on Bank Street in Sharjah. We examined the manufactured cracks and decay in Al Sif along the Dubai Creek. We walked through Bastakia, which maybe you don't know is actually more of a building construction site right now than a fantasy of someone's timelessness. We also walked through the recently trimmed path of Shindaga, and then after that we took the Abra Tadera to go through the crowded souk on our way to a insistently unofficial museum, the Women's Museum. So I think probably most people in this room have taken somebody on this kind of tour through Dubai, the old Dubai, right? And it's not as if Marvi needed to see this. She's been here several times. But I think we wanted to do it because we'd like to incorporate that into the talk, the conversation this evening. First between these two architects, who I will soon introduce, and then later with you too. Marvi will also be sharing some of the insight to her heritage preservation practice in her own city, Karachi, which is also a home for Ayesha. And so now it's my point, now the point I'd like to make is why tonight is so special. And the way I'd like to do that is to give a brief introduction first to our moderator and then our guest. So our moderator this evening is Ayesha Qaisar. She's an architect and an educator, both here in Dubai and also in Karachi. She's lived here in Dubai for the last 8 years, all the while somehow managing not to work for corporate size architecture firms. And I think that might be one of the reasons why that she has a particular way of looking at the city's urban fabric. There's also something else I have to tell you about Ayesha. She participated in night school's first year, and she was one of a group of several people who actually helped shape night school that we have today, and for that we are thankful. The other reason why I'm thankful to Ayesha is that she was the person who introduced me to Marvi's work. So Marvi Mazhar is an architect. She's also a heritage expert, a community activist, a scholar, an educator, and I have to say, she's tough as nails. All of these hats that I've described that she wears them in her regular columns that she writes for a daily newspaper out of Karachi called Dawn. And in these articles, you can see her insisting that we actually can create new realities for our cities, if only we commit to such a thing. I greatly admire the work of Marvi in the way that she's actually been able to maintain a small, viable architectural practice. She's not afraid to describe that process as a non-stop hustle. And I can truly see where that comes from. I think, are there other architects in the room? Some, yes. So I think you will agree with me that it is, in order to keep a small architecture firm running is no small task. The whole act of keeping overhead cost down, keeping your team employed, looking for the next project when you haven't even started the current project. All these things make it all the more difficult. And it's not only that she has been able to maintain such a small, effective office, but she also maintains a commitment to an ethical practice, which I think will be touched upon this evening. She also includes in her practice a research component, and that means that within her office, she will have architects working alongside social scientists. When I first learned about Marvi's work from Ayesha, it was about her commitment to architectural preservation in Karachi. And through our early conversations, we started talking almost a year ago, really. I quickly realized how much more expansive Marvi's approach to heritage is, namely that it's not just about buildings. In fact, it must be about much more than buildings. It has to do with the life around us. But for tonight, we have asked her to focus on the lifelines that run through projects of hers in architectural preservation. To say that a building is preserved would be a fiction, because buildings are dynamic and they are living processes. In other words, we have to tend to our ruins. So this evening, we will be showing you photos. Some of the photographs are shared by Marvi from her practice, images of Karachi. Others are taken from our heritage tour between Sharjah and Dubai. We haven't put them in any sort of order. They're not listed. Some are very clear where you are. Some, maybe you could find yourself in either. And so now I invite Marvi Mazhar and Ayesha Qaisar to begin the conversation. They're going to have about a 45-minute conversation, and then we'll open it up to get some ideas and thoughts from you. So round of applause for our two guests. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and joining us and be willing to listen to us speak. That includes everybody that is coming for the public event, and also the 15 or so night school students who I know are required to attend. I know you had a very nice session with Marvi yesterday in the seminar, and I hope that this will also be fruitful and a sort of nice vein of inquiry. And I'd like to thank Marvi for being here for this conversation, and everybody that helped to put it together, and Todd for being interested always in things beyond the regions that we are inhabiting. So a little bit, Todd really introduced Marvi really well, but one of the things that I didn't know her before, I only knew of her through her work. And the thing that has always fascinated me, which brings me to this conversation as well, is very much the diversity of what Marvi identifies as heritage. It's a practice that I know she's done preservation, architectural preservation, but then I also know, having lived in that city, that all of a sudden there'll be attention given to these very particular trees in an older neighborhood, which I suppose the rest of us have been lamenting that, oh, they're all getting cut down, and all of a sudden we hear in the press, and then we see people going and trying to save them. So there's the banyan trees. Then there's this outlook that she has that, even a small chalk or a small roundabout or a small place where the community gathers is heritage, it's important. So, it's that lens of seeing everything that makes our heritage, whether it's what we're constructing, whether it's a narrative that we've inherited, or it's a question that we're asking ourselves about where we fit into a city. I appreciate that lens of seeing a city and tending to it. So, what I would like to start with, maybe, Marvi, is, if you can tell us a little bit about how you started, or the projects you started with, your training, and then how that has evolved to where you are today in terms of your practice.
Thank you so much for taking our time and being here. To introduce my practice, I would begin from a story, which is how I got influenced and got inspired was through my in-house carpenter. And he was my father's patient. My father practiced in a space which is quite I would say a contested area in Karachi. It's called the Liari. And my parents both started a small medical practice. And over there, half of the practice was basically serving the community and treating patients without charging any fee. So this is now in the mid-80s and 90s, when our parents, both working parents, took us, the children, to the clinic in the evening. And from 6 to 9 o'clock, we sat at the reception, did our homework, while our parents were working. And the relationship building, I remember observing my mother, who was quite a character. She was a gynecologist, but her real job, I think, would have been great if she was in a theater performance or a regular debater. The relationship she had with the community, it was very theatrical. And I remember, if we did well in our studies at 9 o'clock at night when they were closing and shutting down the hospital, she used to tell the community members to perform, and while she used to perform with them. So, it was hardly felt like a very sanitized space. It was more like a community relationship. So I think some of the aspects I picked up was from that early age memory one had. And I graduated from an architecture school in Karachi called the Indus Valley School. My 5-year education in that college was basically project-based, and the kind of projects that were given were very international inspired. The precedence that was given, the case study that was given. And one thing that was a vacuum was the regional studies and the local understanding. So we hardly got that relationship building. It's different now because, of course, the teachers who are coming back and teaching there have a different approach. But back then, in the early 2000s, it was mostly like, studying more about like Philip Johnson and Zaha Hadid, the celebrity architects. But really, what really changed was in the 4th year of my college years, when I entered into this office called the Heritage Foundation. And full of myself, of course, without knowing, entering into that office, anything that I'll demand as a student, it will be fulfilled. And it was Yasmin Lari's office, this incredible woman who was holding the position. And I entered and I said, "I've come here to interview you." And she looked at me and she said, "What do you want to interview me for?" And just mind you, just to let you know that she is one of the big architects. She says that she's the first female architect of South Asia. And I said, "I'm here to understand heritage from you. My teacher told me to meet you." So she said, "Have you read my book, Raj, Karachi, British Raj?" And the title of the book is Karachi, the British Raj city, the dual city. And I said, "No." She said, "Go read that book and then come back." And that book became my Bible, actually, and it really gave me a gateway into understanding the city. Learning the city as a coastal city was more about understanding it from the quarters. Karachi is developed in quarter form. It was like little zones, and each zone had a very diverse neighborhood. So, for example, it has a brass market area, paper market area, civic area. These quarters were developed by the minorities, and it was a pre-partition area. So that's literally the old downtown of Karachi. I hate to use the word downtown, but just for the understanding on a larger level. But that's the historic town of Karachi. And that book opened up, and I understood the mapping systems and all of that. So after like 6 months, I went back again. And I started internship, and my relationship with Heritage Foundation and Mrs. Lari got intense. I, in fact, worked for her for next like 7-8 years after my college graduation. And then I ended up writing a book, which was an MIT publication called Architecture for Future. And we did like a 2-year research on Mrs. Lari's entire work process. So that's my last publication work that I worked on. So Mrs. Lari, then, after college, Yasmin Lari, my relationship with her was, of course, it started off in awe. It started off as working for a celebrity. And then it became into a contested space of two lovers who are trying to get to know each other and then not getting each other. And then I took a break, and then I went for my 2-year master's, and I came back again. So again, that relationship where you're like longing to come back, and then it's going to be troublesome, but then you get yourself into it again. But through Mrs. Lari, I happened to know Karachi in a different way, which my other peers did not understand. So at a very early age, my relationship with Karachi was very field-oriented. I understood more than AutoCAD or Blueprint or computer could teach me. She really opened up this entire space for me where she told me, "Go to Governor House. They have good sandwiches, but try to negotiate for that heritage building." And I was very young, but then, my training became about those sandwiches and plus sitting on the round table and negotiating with the governor. So that really, again, opened an important section, which was working with the government. And that was a very critical point in my practice, that I wanted to emphasize, even when I'm teaching in college, that don't shy away from working with the system. You can be critical about the system, but at least work with the system to understand what are the ruptures. And then From there, in 2014, is when I started my own practice, Marvi Mazhar and Associates. And my first project was, and I was only like 27 then. My first project, which came, I don't know how it came, but it came, was restoration of railway station. It was a big project, and somebody trusted me, and that somebody is a very important person. She's one of the eminent curators and gallery owner. She gave me that to a young person like 27-year-old to restore that building. And I used some of those methodologies, which I never witnessed them at Heritage Foundation. I thought Heritage Foundation had a method which was something to do with more with attached to the government. Here, in this one, I'm not saying it's a unique idea. I'm not saying I was the first one to do it, but I tried to collaborate with civil society. I brought the civil society together into that project, and I made a promise that I'll do parts of that by doing 3 months of opening, rather than doing this one large opening, which is quite, again, a very theatrical thing in Pakistan, in South Asia, everywhere. There's a red ribbon cutting ceremony. We all are aware of that. The chairs come out, and you all are sitting there. We're listening to speeches, and then, the building opens up, and then there's no connection, there's no relationship. I wanted to do it differently. And here, I wanted to do it rather than one opening. I wanted to do it periodic openings. And that kind of brought a very interesting, sustainable methodology. People were were looking forward to entering into that space and they knew that something was going to happen again. Credit to the curator as well. I'm going to dwell a little bit longer on this project because this project helped me in experiment, fail, learn, and also achieve many things. So one of the most important one was opening periodically, and the second one was to include artists and other thinkers. So creating alliance. Must have failed in a methodology in a way that maybe we did not give a larger pragmatics of like how the outside environment works. So some of the artist projects which were like in a public space failed and the materiality didn't work, but at least it gave us a stepping stone to learn that it is okay to create collectives within a built environment. From here, my second project that worth sharing is called the Pakistan Chowk Community Center. It started off with a small grant money where I rehabilitated a public square, like a roundabout. It was inhabited with 3 very dense traffic. And this square became a space of experiment. And this was also the time in 2017 when Aurat March, which is the Women's March, was trying to mold their infrastructure, and they were trying to start their charter. Aurat March was about to begin in the city, and they needed these corner spaces to create a community. So they came to our square, and they're like, we need a more intimate space. And that's how the community center was born, which was right opposite the square, a 2-room space I acquired with like I think it was, I would say $60 a month at that time in 2017. And we started some interesting programming for 3 years till COVID hit. And that project was, again, a relationship building with the city, how we can communicate through these projects. 2 very important projects came out of it. One was Heritage Walk Karachi, an advocacy-based project. It had nothing to do with showing a shiny city, Karachi, but it was more about advocacy. It was more about creating awareness, bringing the young lot to include them. Because also remember that this is the time when relationship building with the government is not easy for the younger generation. And they always felt that separated, like that large gap in between. So this project helped in negotiating and talking about contested spaces, talking about what it means, what does infrastructure mean, what does development mean. And then the last part, which is, again, something to discuss, is the COVID. COVID brought kind of silence in my practice where I got disconnected with the site. I'm a more of a field person. I've done more field work than actual sitting on the desk and designing. So when the field was taken away and the landlock when the city got locked down, that was a time when I silently started walking and documenting the city, the coastal edge. And that's when I started observing the reclamation and the land making, the intensity of that. And that's where the first article that came out called the Karachi Edge became the annexure for the High Court case, where I challenged that the making of the land of that privileged area, which is military owned, is problematic. And that shows now. So the kind of heritage preservation project I used to get 5 years ago, which was more about stone and mortar, I get now on concrete and basement flooding. So I get that kind of restoration projects in the recent times. So that's I would conclude on that practice now continues growing, where I'm talking about ecology and I'm talking about inclusivity of looking at heritage from environmental lens.
And what you've described has been also a series of sometimes contentious discussions, negotiations, whether it's between users, stakeholders, governments, etc. When we picture heritage, or especially in a city like Karachi, with its diverse population, diverse demographics, and very much this fact that it's a port city. I'm glad that you ended on the idea of the coastline and who is coming to it and who is migrating to it to stay and who is coming to sort of transit in and out and trade. And we're sitting in a city that has also been developed. I mean, it's a port city. People have migrated from Karachi to here en route to other places. This region is, has a lot of circular travel first by boat. Now these lines are created in the air with airstreams. Do you want water? Yeah. And what I'd like to know is that one of the things that I always wonder about is who takes ownership or feels ownership of a city where you have these constantly migrating communities, and what are those discussions and those negotiations like, whether it's a top-down affair coming in from a government entity saying this has to be this way or this is what we will preserve, or what do you then start identifying as heritage to different groups of people that may have come in at different times into a city as diverse as Karachi or as diverse as Dubai? And how do you relationship build with those between the built environment and, let's say, the coastline or ecologies, etc.?
I'll try to respond to that in two parts. So observing the edge and looking at the line, which is a very fragile line. It's a line of separation between a porous ground and a non-porous ground. And then there is another line, which is the inner city. So let's talk about the inner city first. The inner city has a very defined line, used to be, which was called Mittadar and Karadar, the two gates, the salt and the sweet. Kara is salt and Mittha is sweet. So this gateways, it's not like any other walled city. It has a very fragile line which defines the inner city in Karachi. Now the inner city is very political. It is very contested in its own way because the inner city that started off as a mohalla has now become a place of godowns and a storage area. And also occupied by this 99 lease system, which is called the Pagdi system in the local language. This is when the real issue starts, that who owns these properties. But then the interesting the phenomena is that the policy, which is the Sindh Heritage Act 1994, doesn't correspond to the actual reality what's taking place in the inner city. The inner city, which was very diverse, had like a fire temple, a gurudwara, a Hindu temple, mosque, you name it. It had layers of density, which is worth documenting and understanding. But then at the same time, a lot of things have shifted. A lot of movement has taken place. The city is a migrant city. Things come and go out. And as the city is sprawling outwards, and Karachi is expanding horizontally as well as vertically, the inner city is now occupied mostly with commercial activities. So when we talk about heritage preservation in Karachi, it is mostly about living heritage. So how do you work with an active space? It's not nostalgia, it's not romanticism. You're not blocking by calling it, now this is going to be Old Town of Karachi. Because where does it start and where does it end is very fluid. And it merges into different areas. So it becomes very challenging. Then how do you work with a city which is constantly moving and alive and working? So it's a very active site. And it doesn't pause, it doesn't stop, it's working constantly. So the act, which is the policy, doesn't correspond to it. The biggest flaw that I would talk about, and then we'll talk about it, I observed during our walk, that in Karachi, that one act clause that says is to preserve the curtain, the wall, which means you gut it out and you take out the soul, which has an important courtyard, it could have inner details, it can have like craftsmanship, it can have an interesting woodwork. But just because the clause says that it's important to safeguard the skin, that means it's superficially preserved. So the act doesn't preserve. The act superficially looks at Old Town. And that's the biggest flaw. So most of the images that you see at the back is my constant fight with the system. That your policy is problematic and what's happening on the ground doesn't correspond or reflect to what's going on. Then the other thing is the edge, which is a coastal edge. Now that line is being constantly reclaimed and expanding into the water. Karachi's coastline architecture is something, apart from this one particular project, everything else is showing the back to the water. We are not looking and accommodating the water. We're actually looking inwards into the city. Apart from 2 or 3 projects, the rest have kind of shown the back to the water. So that also means that the water is considered as a problem. And that has nothing to do with, I say it's the salt in the air which corrodes half of the concrete and the built environment. And rather than working with it, we're working against it. So that's why the water is never accommodated into our built environment. It's considered as a threat. So, but ironically, the land that is being constructed on the water is moving closer to the water. There's a very interesting story written by one of our dear friends, Asif Farooqi, and he talks about, I mean, he passed away, but in the story he says, it's called Sahil ki Samandar ki Chori, which is how would I stolen sea. And in that book, in that chapter, he says that one fine day, the city woke up in the morning and saw that the sea doesn't exist. And people from the last night talked about it as if of a past memory. And that really, it's a fiction story, but it really reflects on today's development, that how we are looking at the sea. It doesn't exist, yet it exists in a very different matter. So the coast has been vandalized on many levels, from the soil to the architecture. And the other thing that's been happening in Karachi in particular, that the preservation of the environment is on a very superficial level. So even when the environmental report or assessment takes place, it only takes place for that 1 week. It has no longer period of relationship building. So when I see, and of course, you know, the phenomena is to become Dubai-esque. The skyline that's being sold on billboards is to show a very glass tower phenomena. So looking at that, it makes one think that what does then heritage has to play in a role in such a larger development sector? Heritage doesn't mean anything. then heritage is not either interwoven into the planning systems, it's kept separate. It's kept as if it's a separate project. It's not part of the master planning, it's not part of the development thinking. It's kept as if it's either a retirement plan for an architect, or it's a project of like a khidmat-e-khalq, which we say as like out of like a goodness.
This idea that you could wake up one morning and there's no sea around you anymore. I think over here also we've gotten used to sometimes waking up some mornings and some things are renamed, or some places don't exist anymore, or the pace of things, I think, in some ways is faster, or that's what is prided on as well, right, in a cosmopolitan city. Now, when the pace is like that and a city can, how do you build heritage in a place where it can be gone the next day, or something can be razed to the ground? And to me, this also ties back with not just what we call or how we define heritage or the things that we're building around us, but the relationship we sort of create or crave with the land, or the shifting of the land. And I think that in port cities, or in cities that have a diverse demographic, we're looking to move as much as we're looking to stay still. So to me, I think it's a bit disingenuous to just say that, oh, people are always transient, or people are always moving on, and that's why they don't tend, or they won't care, or that may be why they've turned their back to something. But I think that the idea of movement between all these cities, and the very, and it's a privilege. Just in this night school, we've had a talk where we saw about, people that were being moved and that were purling, and it was not necessarily by choice. So I understand that. But these are all, in some way, we're all nomadic or migrating communities that are circulating around connected lands. And I'd just like to know how you feel, or how you feel that sense of movement between all these lands along the coastlines, whether it's the coastline in Pakistan or it's people coming here and then going back, and that transfer of bodies has also affected how they define their own heritage, right? So like if it's a Parsi community that lived and built Karachi but has now moved on from it and is somewhere else in the world, how are they associating themselves with a heritage back home, architectural or otherwise?
So the preconceived notion is that when you read about the history of Old Town, and you engage and you see some of the archives, you see a lot of like investment by the minorities or people who built Karachi, some eminent people who came from diverse backgrounds. You think automatically that the relationship of their grandparents or their parents who have invested so much in building Karachi must be, they might just still have that relationship, and it's okay to go to them and ask for support. In the last, I would say 15 years, there's been a shift. The people who built Karachi and the families who had a relationship with the city don't feel the same anymore. Of course, migration has taken place. A lot of them have moved out. Their families have moved out. But on the same end, people who are also living have also become really contained within themselves. They don't want to have a relationship with the city in the same way as they did before. And it has to do with this sudden boom in real estate. You want to invest in real estate constantly. And that's become the new way of like the money power. So if you even pitch in that this building is very important, it has a collective memory, they don't want to preserve it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They don't want to even put a seed money into it or share archives, because then they think if this gets listed or this becomes into a heritage site, it will become a problem for their long-term investment goals. Because they really want to sell that building, or it's a capitalistic approach right now that if we sell this building now, it'll give us a return, or It's so basically one of the buildings that you must have seen here, which is in midst of the rubble, and only the skin is remaining. It's owned by one of eminent business family, and I went to them, and I have a relationship with this building for last like 10 years. I've been writing about it. I've been constantly trying to ask a few people to get together and let's preserve this building. But I constantly get like a blockade. I get to a point where people are willing to invest in it and create into maybe like a cultural center. But then the owners of the building don't want to do anything with it. And it has to do because the real estate is much more powerful than the thinking of heritage preservation. That makes me think that where is the issue? Where does the issue lie? It lies because in our institutions, we are not taught heritage as being an important factor of the city. On grassroots level, we are not taught that heritage has an important integration towards looking forward and thinking about development from that perspective. Then it also has to do with the kind of practitioners that are existing in the city. Hardly there's any, like there must be like 5 or 6 actual people who are working in heritage. Rest are working as if it comes as a project of, let's say, as a celebrity project, or a project that will give a larger name. But the smaller nexus, it's easy to actually, in Karachi or generally in Pakistan, to restore public buildings or to look at project in isolation. But to look into a neighborhood, it becomes challenging. It becomes critical, because then you are looking at how the shared courtyards are working, how the shared walls are working, how the shared views are working. And then the most important part is the scale, to preserve the scale. I'm more, let's say, invested in preserving the scale, which is ground plus 3, which is very humanistic architecture. The moment you disconnect and think about ground plus 42, which is what right now all the builders and all the heritage owners aspire to own, they're like, okay, you just want to preserve the skin, right? So we'll give you the skin. Give us the internal, because we want to go ground plus 42. What does that do to that scale, which is ground plus 3 facade? It just leaves like a fragile skin. It doesn't mean anything on the 30th floor. What will that do to that stone facade? So it really bothers me as an architect working in the city that what we are doing right now as this craze of development is to completely disconnect ourselves from history, from archives, from lived experiences, from collective thinking, from collective community making. So that's one point that I really wanted to raise within this aspect, that we don't want to look at heritage as a theoretical experience of like, hey, let's restore this, and this will become a place of arrival. It shouldn't be. It should be a space of lived neighborhood, which has a relationship with outside as well as inside.
So in that same vein, when we walked around, so we walked through Bastakia, we were in Shindaga, we walked through parts of Sharjah, we saw some buildings being demolished, we looked at various facades and how they've been adjusted to propose a particular image. And now the idea of heritage is one that can also be constructed, right? I mean, it's what we feel may belong or may form our past and a legacy. But when we're also looking into the future, it's, and the motivations, I suppose, behind that. And now we get into methodologies, right, of heritage preservation or tending to it, is that, there can be various motivations. For people, it could be part of a collective memory, so a building may not be important in any kind of architectural canon. We went to the Flying Saucer. It's debatable whether that's an important building in the architecture of the region, but it matters to people. It matters. It's part of their memory, their lived memory of a city, of a space, and now it has a new use. Similarly, we walk through places which are catering to, I suppose you could say, tourists, or to building a particular story of a city, right? That, oh, we had this history, we had this heritage. Now, whether that's a top-down approach or that's a bottom-up approach, you know, what or what has your experience been of, and anything that you remarked upon as well, or that stood out to you in terms of walking through these spaces? Because I suppose in a way you were the visitor, right? Like, we inhabit this city, we may not remark on some of these spaces, or we may, but because there's a particular architecture, a particular symbolism, a particular time from the past that will get picked up on and be shown, because that's the story that wants to be told. So you've got shiny new Dubai, you've got modern Dubai with all of its very interesting facades. I heard you many times say, oh, this is just like, this reminds me of Karachi, or this is just, you know, there were so many times where we connected on that when we were sitting in the Abra, or things like that. I think it's a lot about also the stories people carry into each of these cities. So is there anything that sort of stood out to you, or is there anything you feel about the methodologies we use to give importance to what is heritage or to define heritage?
That's a tough one because I'm an outsider here. One thing really made me excited when I saw like the banyan tree and the peepal tree in the courtyards, especially the neem tree. I got really excited to see that, and that just reminds me of Karachi. Those three like trees, as wherever we saw them, I got really like excited about it, and that showed me like, you know, I mean, it could be that some families from South Asia must be living in that area who had planted them or has some indigenous history maybe here. But, you know, I mean, heritage has a lot of methodologies. There is, of course, the ICOMOS terminologies, which tells you that preserve, reconstruct, remake, and restore. There is rehabilitation, conservation, preservation. These are all terminologies, right? And you think about them and then and connect it to the built environment. That how does your methodology sit here? So reconstruction and rebuilding comes in the times of when there is a war or there is some kind of disaster or a challenging moment where things have shifted. But it seemed like while walking, a lot of reconstruction was taking place. It's like an afterthought that, hey, let's build this neighborhood again. I don't know how I feel about that, but then it is a one seed towards thinking of history and utilizing that as part of your conversation with the city. But at the same time, in South Asia, heritage in high zones where heritage is understood and it's part of the infrastructure and it's part of their tourism systems, preservation is their agenda. It's their point number one. But as you see that development takes over and development becomes the larger umbrella body, then heritage is usually taken from a rehabilitation perspective. And that is to do with preserving for that moment. If gives them any economies of scale and if gives them any return, then it is included. But it is not considered as something that you would want to, a fortified methodology. So looking at Flying Saucer as a project made me really happy that it was a collective memory. It was a chicken shop, a cooperative society, but then it's now a gallery and it's like needed to exist. So the radical thing is that there was a fight for, or there was a conversation, or there was a discussion for it to exist. And I think that is one of the most important seeds, that it should exist.
Was there anything that you've had to do where you had a good moment like that, where, you know, you felt like you won a battle?
Pakistan Chowk was more of a square, but I feel like national food, there's a colonial heritage bungalow that I restored. That had that preservation aspect to it, that the family wanted it to be there, it exists, and they wanted to have a new development enveloped around it. So that became the jewel architecture of the center. So that's one project that you can, say that it had that existence.
Thank you. Just, I think, carrying on from this conversation about the flying saucer and that the need for it to be there, but it's converted to an art space. And we see this trend where it becomes an art space, but then who's it for and who's using it? And yeah, I mean, even I think recently, and this is Abu Dhabi related, like the bus stop, I think is part of this public art biennial, which is another topic. But yeah, that because it's one of the spaces that's used for an exhibition space. So it's an old bus terminal, which now recently like, oh, it's going to be converted into an art space. And I'm like, okay, why not bring it back as a functioning bus terminal? And it's hard here to have these conversations like you're having in Karachi, you know, with the authorities or the government, because I think the decisions are made final. There's no room for community voices to influence and make changes. So I understand people who kind of shelter or disconnect because, yeah, I don't know. So these are just random thoughts. There's no question per se. But
Yeah.
thank you. It's a really good conversation because there's a lot of relevance to here as well. Thank you.
I totally agree with you. I just want to build upon what you just said, and it's not a response, but it's just to think with you. It's very easy for buildings when they get when they are ghosted, and then the next big project to implement is from the cultural district. Either they want to become like a museum, a small scale, or an art space or a gallery. It's easy to implement that. But what's difficult is for it to its original form or to have a feasibility that will serve the community. I think that becomes like a critical thought.
I think also it reminds me of a conversation we were having about how much, with the story of heritage that we build, do we, sometimes when we're trying to beautify a space, right? This is what we were talking about, is that when you preserve, beautify, we do it to the point where we end up gatekeeping, right? And then it's not necessarily serving a purpose within a community, or it's only serving a purpose, because now we've brought along erasure, right? Versus inclusion,
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me again, in Lahore, there was a project of Orange Line, which was a metro station. And at that time, the metro station was designed on a blueprint and looked at the city on a map, not actually go to the site and do a survey. And somebody is shaking their head, so they agree with me. And that line went past through mohallas, which is a community, went through heritage sites, passed through the main internal city, and there was a heritage small scale building. And the president very conveniently said, "It's okay, let the metro pass, I'll rebuild the heritage." Which shows that on a grassroots level, you're very disconnected. What it means, development versus a city being cut through, it's like a deep wound. And in that wound, a lot of history and memories get erased. And that's a violence which I am always questioning when development takes place.
I wanted to ask, kind of building off what you mentioned about gatekeeping, if maybe you could speak to the concept of public space in Pakistan, specifically what you're talking about with like the coastline and development on the coastline and just how public access is looked at. I mean, I think, to offer an example, I was in Cairo recently and they've built walkways along the Nile that they charge for entry, right? And again, you think about something that is like so essential, right? Like the waterfront to that city, right? And how it is being kind of gatekept in a way. So I just wonder if maybe if you could speak to that, and also in the context of of the built environment as well, right? The issue of when developers maybe they like build a park or something, right? And then it's like, oh, the park closes at 9 o'clock, right? And no one's allowed in after that, right? Like things of that nature, I think. But yeah.
Are you sure you didn't work with me in Karachi? That's something I would say. So I wish there was a flip chart board here and I could draw and explain it to you because there's a perfect example for me to explain this. But before that, what was the thought that I had in mind was here I would quote Abdul Malik Simone's work, which is quite sexy, and you should read about it, that how he talks about the cities. And so in Karachi, I mean, the most public space, and which is the epitome of the publicness you can talk about, is the coast, the coastal edge. So from one point, if you step down from the road level into the sand, and if you walk from the sand, you can almost go around like this and come back to another part of the city. That's how clear the flow is. But recently, in the last 5 years, small projects have started protruding outwards into that sandy area, which is Imar. And they have a gated community. So the last edge is the water then. So they've blocked it here, then that means you have to come up, then go down again. But then there is an army project, which is called the DHA. And they think they're gods of the development sector. So then there's a golf course there, thinking that it's a soft grounds, it's a green course, and it's golf, where I don't know what men do for the longest hours, just shake on that ball and think about the world. But that's where the whole problem comes out. I think they think about all the development during that golf coursing. So then again, that's blocked and that's gated. Then you come back again. Then there are another apartment block. So these protrusions are all coming out from external development sector. So we've been writing a lot about this, that the sand is being sold to these gated communities. And these gated communities are selling the views of unobstructed view of the city. What does it mean when you are selling unobstructed view? It's a very privileged view. It's a very top-down view. It's the view which they're showing on billboards of blue skies and blue water. But down there, person who's walking on the sand has no relationship with that gatedness. And it really makes you think about that how architecture separates you. It doesn't bring communities together. It doesn't bring the cities together. It actually creates separation. And that separation becomes a contested atmosphere. That separation brings an urge. There's a video that I showed my class yesterday where the fishermen in the water were looking at the city from their lens and saying it looks like we're looking at another country and we are another border. Okay? So that pain in the eyes of a fisherman who thinks this is their edge and they can come in and out whenever has been taken away through the surveillance, through the wall, which is called, what's that? You guys also have it here, when the stones are put onto the edge, which creates like a buffer. And that buffer is, breakwater. And that itself is the moment when the edge is fortified, and you know that the fortification means a wall.
Yes, hi. I have actually a comment. Yeah, and the question. So the comment is, I think one of my biggest takeaways from your talk today is the idea of heritage being socially constructed. It's not just about how old the building is, but rather what value is the community placing on these spaces that they want to protect and preserve in some way. And another point you guys bring up is this the lack of collaboration between disciplines. And I see this problem not just within architecture, as you're talking about, but even within my own field in mental health and the healthcare sector as well, and how that creates more problems than it solves. So I'm curious about if you have seen any initiatives or projects where we're more collaborative with the community and also interdisciplinary that actually worked, and what did that look like, even if at a very small scale? Like, I'm curious about either promising, or I don't know if I like those success stories, but I guess they're going in a promising direction as opposed to reinforcing more of the separations that you're talking about.
I don't know about a build project, that way. I'm sure in the developed regions may have case studies like that, where interdisciplinary aspect has taken place. But we have made concepts where I truly believe a city cannot be built by architects and urban planners only. It needs to be thought out in an interdisciplinary manner, where you have where you have artists, lawyers, feminist thinkers, um, even health sector coming together and looking at the city. Because ideally speaking, a good city is where different professions come together and think about neighborhood development. I don't even want to consider zonal planning or master planning. I think it's a fad. Master plan is the biggest fad. It's like, I think, brings a lot of grant and money, and it goes and dissipates. What really is needed is neighborhood planning. And best would be to actually create an alliance with the community members themselves, because they are the grassroots information givers. Where does the water system doesn't work? Which road doesn't work? Which I mean, in South Asia, we have a lot of seepage issues, water sewerage issues, and those are the main critical things that everybody wants: a walking area, a right to the city, right to walking, right to inhabiting public spaces. So all of those things come together when academia and different professions kind of lay out a system. So maybe one day that'll happen. And I don't know about the project. We can talk more about that through email. I can think about it, and it doesn't come top of my mind right now. But I'm sure there must be.
Hiya. This is more of a comment, and I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it. But we've used the word heritage a lot tonight, and it's a term that I think I frankly have trouble with, in the sense that, especially in the context of state-sanctioned narratives on heritage, it makes me question what is defined as heritage, who gets to decide, what is the criteria and everything. I mean, the prime example that comes to mind for me is the Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi, which was this site where it was like the first children's library, first theater. It was a major center for the arts in the city up until, I believe, around 2008 or 2009 when they wanted to demolish it. And it was such an important place for all of the people over there that everyone obviously started getting angry over it and was like, no, you can't demolish this. This was part of our, our collective history. To the point where I believe after a year of it being on hold, they decided, no, actually, we're going to save this because a lot of people are complaining that, okay, this is actually important, and we're actually going to preserve this area. So it makes me think about how, we can involve community in conversation with, yes, these systems. But in turn, that does make me think about something that I talked about yesterday, which is this initiative of preserving certain sites in Abu Dhabi, like 64, like an arbitrary number, versus 700 plus demolished sites still counting. Very much what you said, that the narrative that's being played out isn't reflecting what's on the ground. And so it makes me think about how, who gets to decide what is considered important enough. I mean, the same site I was just talking about, Cultural Foundation, was used as an excuse to expand its area, which led to the demolition of my building and 7 others. So when I mentioned that I was evicted in December 2024. So at what point does heritage itself start to become violent? You know what I mean? It's I don't know. Yeah, that's my rant about the term heritage. So
I know. I totally understand that heritage comes with a loaded outline, and sometimes it's like, heritage also separates you, sanitizes the politics of heritage preservation. In that case, I mean, I would say that when there's the world's largest necropolis site is in the province I come from, Sindh. It's called Makli, and Makli is a living heritage site. It has its tombs, which is heritage sites, and around it are these shrines that came up in the last, let's say, like 90 years or 40 years, and then keep on coming, because those shrines are related to dreamscapes. So if one of the shrine goers has a dream, then he can go and place a flag there. So it's a living site, but it's also a World Heritage Site, Makli. In a World Heritage Site, the clause says you cannot enter, you have to close it. It has to be between 9 to 5, right? And at night, it needs to close. It needs to have a fencing. So what does that do? It sanitizes, right? It separates the community from that site. So we challenged it to the World Heritage Site. We said it's a living heritage site. You cannot separate it. You cannot pause it. I understand by pausing, you're giving a break to the heritage site for repair, mending, all of that thing. But has to have a system where the community keeps entering into the site in some way where there is no stopping, because those shrines around it makes the site an active site. So this is what I said in the beginning. A neighborhood that's been looked into as an old town cannot be in a romantic way or a nostalgic way. It has to be some way where it's an active site. So somewhere like, these international guidelines don't sit with the region thinking. And the region thinking is more critical, not the international.
Good evening. I'm not an architect. But I was just wondering, connecting back to the comment on the shorelines utilized. Sometimes debatable heritage sites can also include natural icons. I can think, for example, even in my history, trees in iconic places, or places that people go and reunited in those locations can be a square with a tree. I never been in Karachi, but I consider our mangroves. So I believe that the shoreline is a living area. It becomes a heritage, a place where community work reunited. But these, I don't know, have they ever been considered heritage sites or considered throughout this development and from an architectural point of view?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Thank you for that comment. The ecology is part of the heritage, and it's very important. Do you see that? Yeah. So absolutely, I agree with you. Yes.
Mine is a basic question. How would you compare Dubai with Karachi and Dubai with Sharjah? Do you see maybe that Dubai right now is the future image or darkest timeline of some cities like Karachi? In a very, this is in jest, of course. So, because this is how I feel about my own city. You mentioned this I'mar properties, and I felt like it was quite relatable and quite the trend in some nations, as we discussed lightly yesterday.
I would gently take that question and pass it to Ayesha. I think she will be better to respond to that.
Well, I wouldn't compare, first of all, because I think every city has its own spirit. I think when we try to supplant a common spirit on all of these cities, that's where we sort of start to fail a little bit. That's not to say that there are not commonalities, okay? And that's not to say that we don't aspire towards a sense of development, progress, future-looking, all of those things. Ambition is as much a human, goal, emotion, progress, etc., whatever you want to call it, as a hearkening to a past or nostalgia is, right? The trite phrase is everything in moderation, but everything in moderation doesn't sell very well. We're always negotiating between, it seems, these two extremes. It's always dangerous when something gets erased. It's always dangerous when things are deliberately made precarious. Dubai pitches itself as being future thinking and just a leap into the future. But you have to recognize how, I don't know if meteoric is the right word, but how the trajectory of development has been so quick in some ways. Now, some things will be lost. And it does become a model for cities like I'm from Karachi, right? It's only natural. I don't think we should take away the opportunity to marvel at what has been achieved. I think that it's absolutely okay to do that while recognizing the consequences or what's come along with it, right? You cannot replicate, you can keep trying, you cannot replicate one city onto another. And at the same time, I would say that it would be dishonest of me not to admit that I like some of the replicas I navigate through in this city. As a woman from, we call it South Asia now, but I'm just going to say as a woman from Pakistan, I like the anonymity or the sterilization of some parts of this city. And then I like to go to other parts of it, which are instantly recognizable to me, a small hardware shop in Dera. Everybody talks of, we romanticize a lot of these crowded places, etc., quite a bit, because they remind us of home, or they remind us of this or that or the other, and we navigate them differently. And we step in and out, because we're human beings, we cherry pick everything, you know.
But just to add on to that, I asked Ayesha today, where do you eat a good biryani from? And she said, which kind?
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
There's Goan biryani,
Yeah.
there's a Sindhi Memon biryani, there is like lots of different types of biryani. So something that's limited in the coastal city that I come from, there's only one type of biryani.
There's an entire world of it.
So biryani is a political thing for us, you know, like which biryani do you like to have?
Yeah.
So I think...
So, exactly, and I think that, you know, we forget sometimes, or maybe we don't, but, you know, sort of the footprints or the footsteps we're walking in, whether it's here, back home, they've been traversed before, right? And in a city like this, you know, it may seem more precarious. Something's here one day, it's gone the next. It's going to be a replica. You're going to get an MR development here or something there and all that, and you're going to lose sight of things. But I don't know. I'm sure more landed, grounded places are just as precarious. And it's just all about keeping your eye on the ball, right? To some extent, or trying to. So the short answer is I wouldn't compare. I don't know the correct answer.
Sorry from that. I returned to the shoreline in the previous conversation. And I just wanted to point out that if you come to Abu Dhabi, the Corniche is the place of orientation. It's not a place of orientation, it's a line of orientation. And that is also, I would say, over the years, it showed itself as being the marketplace of Abu Dhabi. If one thinks of the National Day conversion of all the people there, their cars and their noise and I don't know whether you've seen this, but it's absolutely chaotic, but that's the place where people go when they want to get together. And that is nationals and everybody, particularly young people nowadays. But there's an interesting phenomenon with this Corniche, because if you look at pictures of the 1950s, 60s, aerial photographs and so on, there's a shoreline. You look at the aerial photographs of now, the shoreline is exactly the same. Now, is that by a deliberation of preservation, or is it by, you know, has it just happened that way? But it is the whole way along as the Corniche is in front of the original shoreline. The original shoreline, the Fluchtlinie, as we say in German, is preserved. And what also is interesting is that there are, of course, very high-rise buildings up to 28 stories or so, some of them, yes, and impressive buildings, but nothing has protruded towards the sea. And this is, I think, an interesting phenomenon. And one wonders whether that was by design or whether it was by giving the Corniche this very extra, the space that the Corniche takes into the sea to give it this very special meaning, which also maybe one has to add, it has been extended twice. Because it was maybe thought that it's a space that is so important and representative as well, that one extended further into the sea and not mess about, I must say, with what is built on that original shoreline.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. I mean, that also makes me resonate and build upon what we said just right now, that the, the edge or the coast is a very important space making and a place making, I would say, for us in South Asia. If you look at the archives or you look at Bollywood films, the water relationship is where the chowpatty, where people sit, eat, have their first dates, or lovers are walking, families are with their kids, or renting out a plastic chair for 10 rupees and sitting in the water with that chair. All of these archival photographs that one sees from the 90s or earlier in the 60s or the 70s, coming all the way now, you see that that still remains, even as the coast is shrinking and narrowing to that publicness, but the activities still remain the same. But at the same time, I mean, it's amazing that to hear that Abu Dhabi has kept that as like a preserved site. And that also makes one think that respecting the edge in an ethical practice is so important.
Oh, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask about the role of image making and also social media in your work. Because, for instance, yesterday you started the presentation showing us the two films. And now, as a segue to this question, last question as well, like the role of image nowadays, that we get to experience places and buildings more through images than being actually there, and how this can be incorporated into design and the making of places. Because the first instance that I can imagine, that I recall, of an architect actually taking, let's say, Instagram into consideration was the design of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. And that was actually before Instagram became big. So that was the first time that I actually woke up to that idea that the making of the image by the people who are visiting would actually help the making that place special. So I just wanted to know if you think about that and how do you go about that?
I only know about social media being a stalker. I'm a stalker of all the government offices. I stalk them to their core. And I keep looking at that, what's their next agenda when it comes to development. No, I'm just kidding. Social media has really helped me a lot. You know, whenever I have given my most pro bono design outlines, it's been like a doctor's prescription. I put it out and I'm like, hey, look at the solution, and I float it out. Next thing I know, it gets screenshot and goes in the newspaper. So, you know, I mean, and this is not coming from a top down from mine. I have a collective. And in that collective, we all do these guerrilla acts of like design aspects, where quickly someone comes with a solution. Even if a sewerage line is disrupting an area, a community, we come up with a solution and we float it out online. Some government officer picks it up and says, hey, listen, there's a free design, let's do this and implement it. So we use that a lot, and it's a radical practice that we use, apart from stalking.
I actually wanted to ask about something that's strangely absent this evening. I think it's the first time I've ever attended an architectural heritage talk where we didn't talk about style or age or era or, and it also started to think about notions of the master plan and, you know, Dubai's master plan, at least the 1971 master plan, has areas of preservation in it. And I started to think about this kind of approach to preservation as a designation, as a zoning, which then also gets into the ability to measure heritage through details, through quantifying the details. For example, you've been in Saudi Arabia, Rassam Badran's work for Najd architecture. What is Najd architecture? It is now officially, you know, a kind of visual encyclopedia of what one should have represented. And I kind of see that as then, it's not just so much a top-down thing, but it's also then becomes what one imagines heritage is from the bottom up. I mean, it then, in fact, kind of going back to Miguel about the idea of what's on social media. Social media is also based on that as well, because that's what we've been fed. And I guess maybe my question would be then, what this absence? It's an intentional absence. So if you don't want to talk about the absence, could you at least talk about the reason why it's absent?
I would reflect on that question a little bit more, but what, like, you mean by the absence of what the new thinking is in the built environment? Like styles Yeah. So I mean, of course we didn't talk about it, but Karachi's architecture, historically speaking, is very diverse. It is a lot of aesthetics, a lot of craftsmanship. You see that the families who were rich invested more in the outline. But what really stood out is the scale. They respected each other's rooftops. So one rooftop is connected to the other one. And that kind of brought a real different kind of real estate, that one is on the ground level, which is the street level, but then there is also one on the rooftops where they all are connected to each other. And one's rooftop becomes another person's terrace. So that kind of neighborhood sharing is very critical and very important to talk about it. This is Karachi, but in Lahore, it becomes even more exciting because there's a kite flying phenomena. And springtime, people use each other's rooftops to share that play. And that play is called through loitering, through understanding, through viewing. And then the style is also something we follow. I remember when we saw the flying saucer, and it had a timeline, and it went through its original form. Then there was this material that was stuck on it, aluco bond, and Todd became really excited on that, and I was like, gosh, it reminds me of Army's favorite material, aluco bond. And this is their favorite way of
Modernizing it, yeah, instant modernity.
Instant modernity. How do you instantly have like a quick solution towards modernism? You add aluco bond onto it. So I think that way I would say that the styles and the kind of craftsmanship that exists in Karachi gets lost in these larger queries, which was what this gentleman in the front talked about, archives and what heritage means. Those are the larger questions that one gets faded away and not look into those intricate details.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your work and also talking about the problem areas. I was very interested when you mentioned about the Heritage Act of '84 and how the government is very superficially trying to preserve, and especially the post-colonial separation has rendered a lot of these contested spaces within the city. What I'm trying to ask is, how do you, when you talk about the act of heritage preservation, and the collective memory, like you mentioned, it feels more personal to you as opposed to the government or the owner. And how do you sort of try to deal with that conflict of interest and also advocate with the state or the owner? And if you can talk about some of the measures as to how to deal with that situation.
We need to have coffee. So the personal part is, of course, that's something like something separate. I'm going to come back to that. But generally speaking, I feel what in an ideal world, one really thinks that heritage needs a very important attachment, and that is which architecture itself needs it. And I feel it's important, which is activism. Activism in the built environment. If people had say and think that pushback is something that can be used as a power, it'll bring a lot of change. And I wish it was a coursework in an undergraduate level. When this gentleman talked about that how the community came together and that was not demolished, that means the power of people. That means the power of say is important. And once you show that, it brings a change. I have done that by creating a pushback for a very important public park called Frere Hall Gardens. They were trying to fence it. It's not my backyard. It's not my park. I don't even live in that neighborhood. But I know that that space gets occupied by a lot of young people, with the queer community, with a lot of other kind of communities which come from far off, who want to dwell, and also the immediate neighborhood. In the evening, the only thing which is amazing about, one of the important and amazing thing about Karachi is the hawa, which is the air. In the evenings, people want to come out and sit down while the electricity rates are very high till 10 p.m. They don't want to switch on the air conditions, or they don't want to, there's no and these apartments can be very tight. So they all want to come out in the evening and sit with their families. If you do a gatekeeping of a park and say, let's close it, what this gentleman talked about, that let's close it at 7 o'clock because it's dark now and the security needs to take place, you're disconnecting a whole community from utilizing that space. So I stood out. I brought some of my architects, friends, and some artists community. Suddenly, the entire TikTokers from that park, they also came and stood over there. And they all were like, great, the TikTok made it happen. There's no wall right now over there. So the power of social media, the power of people made it happen. That's a different story, that I had to take that bureaucrat to the court separately, and now he hates me, and I can't do any public project in that particular sector, which is Murtaza Wahab, by the way, Marhaba, which I was telling you about. So this one bureaucrat, I had to take him just because he was at that time not understanding the importance of fencing. But when it became into a court case, then it got stopped, and people's power.
So we have time for one last question, I think, Giacomo? Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for this amazing talk, which was very, very insightful. But I was wondering, how fair is it to criticize urbanization and advocate for preservation of heritage sites when considering that this space would be needed for countries' growing population and their needs? So how do we differentiate which projects are necessary and which projects are just maybe for beautification or just for tourist attraction? Like, how do you differentiate?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm very anti-beautification, and I'm super anti making projects. As I said earlier, I set that tone in the beginning that nothing to do with freezing the moment and keeping it for tourist infrastructure. Not at all. I mean, if the growing population and the growing phenomena asks for verticality, then you got to go and think about different zones, different areas where then commute becomes an important thing, then the infrastructure for public transportation becomes an important thing. And when we say that scalability needs to be preserved, those can be converted into low-cost housing, working-class housing. It can create into the catering of what is needed for that area. So that is super important. Not at all critically putting down urbanization, because as I said, you cannot think about urbanization without integrating different aspects of a city. And where I said that heritage becomes an important phenomena, development also becomes a critical thing. But unless and until there's no marriage between the two, you will always think as a separate project. You will always consider it as a separate, like a sideline project. And therefore, the negativity of beautification comes in. And that's where a lot of times, like for example, Asian Development Bank comes and brings in money to do development infrastructure, public transportation lines, for example. And they will say, we will not consider heritage because it's a problematic factor. World Bank does the same thing. So every project that brings money into the city has a footnote which says we don't want to deal with heritage because it is a complicated phenomena. So I think that is absolutely showing your back to a problem. So I feel like urbanization needs to integrate this aspect.
I think we're at the end here. A round of applause for our moderator and our guest this evening. Yeah. Thank you very much. Marvi has performed 2 nights in a row on 2 rather different topics, so thank you for that marathon. I also just want to say it's really lovely to see lines coming in and out of the conversations today. Coastlines, which are porous, versus more concrete barriers which divide. I wanted to promote a book of Marvi's, this book about Yasmin Lari, Architecture for the Future. We had it on sale in the shop here. Unfortunately, it's sold out even before Marvi got to town. The good news is it's in the library as an ebook, which you can access via the Jamia Library, even from the comfort of your own home. And it's a really lovely book, at once specifically about architecture and moving beyond it. I also just want to remind you about our final open event at Night School, which will be this Saturday. We begin at 6 p.m. to avoid traffic troubles. At 6 p.m. we begin with the film program Unraveling with artist and film curator Hind Mizena, who's returning for her 4th Night School film event with us, fortunately. And I hope you can be there with us. And a thank you to Yazan for making this happen this evening. Thank you. Good night. Hello?
I developed these zines for the class, but you can pick it up for free. Anybody wants it. This was a zine that I shared with the students yesterday. So if you want to take a copy, you're most welcome to.